On October 7th, newly elected Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi drew international attention by claiming that a contingency in the Taiwan Strait could place Japan in a survival-threatening situation. Yet, this framing is selective. Even without any scenario involving Taiwan's reunification, Japan could push itself toward a genuinely survival-threatening path through its own policy choices. Moves such as pursuing nuclear weapons, acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, or abolishing Article 9 of the Constitution would not enhance Japan's security. They would fundamentally destabilize the region and revive historical fears that Japan itself once helped create. Given Japan's past, such steps would not be viewed as normal deterrence, but as reckless escalation, testing limits that history has already shown to be catastrophic. Although this turmoil originating after Takaichi's statement started more than a month ago, its shockwave ripples continue to shake the international community. This turmoil is not temporally extensive, but from this, we could still see the intertwining of Chinese, American, and Japanese interests. So, let's have an overview. The trigger was a statement by Japan's Prime Minister, Takaichi, regarding Taiwan during a budget committee session of the Japanese Diet, roughly analogous to the House of Representatives. When a lawmaker from the Constitutional Democratic Party, CDP, Katsuya Okada, asked whether Japan would regard a Chinese blockade of the Taiwan Strait as a survival-threatening situation, Takaichi responded that if China merely lined up warships and blocked Japanese vessels, Japan would not define it as such. However, she added that if China were to deploy forces to take control of the island, Japan would. What stands out is that Okada appeared to deliberately give Takaichi room to step back or soften her wording, warning that such statements could place Japan itself in danger. Takaichi chose not to do so. Instead, she bluntly asserted that a Chinese military operation to reunify Taiwan would very likely be considered a survival-threatening situation for Japan. The irony is clear. Even the United States, Japan's primary ally, has avoided officially declaring that a military reunification of Taiwan would constitute a survival-threatening scenario for itself. Takaichi, by contrast, went further than Washington, rhetorically placing Japan closer to the front line of a conflict it neither initiates nor controls. Takaichi has presented herself as a political successor to Shinzo Abe, who once claimed that a Taiwan issue is a Japan issue. Yet her handling of this moment arguably lacked Abe's calculated ambiguity. Rather than hedging, she opted for a direct and maximalist framing, suggesting less strategic caution than she may have intended. More critically, her remarks appeared to downplay the consequences of military intervention in the Taiwan Strait. If the Japan Self-Defense Forces were to strike a Chinese vessel during a reunification scenario, Beijing would have a clear casus belli to target Japanese military sites it deems threatening. Given historical memory, Chinese public opinion would impose few moral constraints on such retaliation. In that sense, Okada's warning was well-founded. Japan risked placing itself in danger through its own words as much as through any action by China. The immediate trigger was Takaichi's statement on November 7th, but the more important question is what lay beneath it. Why did she deliberately choose a confrontational posture toward China? To understand this, it is necessary to examine Japan's domestic, economic, and political conditions. On the macroeconomic level, consumer price inflation remained moderately high at around 3%. This figure was among the highest seen in the past decade and signaled a sustained rise in overall prices. In contrast to persistently elevated inflation, Japan's real GDP growth was uneven. Quarter-on-quarter real GDP growth hovered just above zero in Q1 and rose to 0.5% in Q2, but then fell sharply to negative 0.6% in Q3, reflecting a slowing domestic economy as well as the impact of tariff arrangements with the United States. For households, the strain was even more visible. Housing prices in major cities continued to rise, food prices increased rapidly, and rice prices remained unusually high. Together, these trends point to rising living costs, at least at a moderate level, and imply a decline in average real household income. It is therefore reasonable to suggest that living conditions for many Japanese citizens in 2025 were far from favorable. Electoral outcomes further reflected public dissatisfaction with economic stagnation, as voters elevated Takaichi, a figure often described as leaning toward far-right populism. Historically, politicians of this type tend to gain traction during periods of economic anxiety rather than stability. Under such circumstances, externalizing domestic pressure by amplifying foreign tensions becomes a familiar political tactic. Provoking disputes abroad can serve to redirect public frustration, mobilize nationalism, and consolidate political support, suggesting that Takaichi's hardline toward China may have been driven as much by domestic vulnerability as by strategic calculation. Another, more structural reason lies in the long-standing agenda of Japan's right-wing political establishment. Figures such as Eisaku Sato and Shinzo Abe consistently promoted the idea of so-called state normalization, a project aimed at shedding the post-war constraints imposed on Japan, most notably the restrictions on possessing nuclear weapons and waging war. Takaichi follows directly in this lineage. Like her predecessors, she appears committed to advancing the same objective, and provoking tensions in the Pacific serves a clear political purpose, manufacturing a sense of imminent external threat. Such a climate of perpetual insecurity can then be used to argue that Japan's current constitutional framework is inadequate, thereby paving the way for constitutional revision. In this light, confrontational rhetoric toward China looks less like an isolated misstep and more like a deliberate strategy to reshape Japan's legal and strategic posture under the cover of national survival. On November 8th, China's Consul General in Osaka, Xue Jian, posted a controversial tweet, deleted the following day, stating, "That filthy neck that barged in on its own. I've got no choice but to cut it off without a moment's hesitation. Are you prepared for that?" What followed was largely predictable. Japanese media quickly declared that a Chinese diplomat crossed the line, and public criticism in Japan surged, with many assuming, without explicit evidence, that the remark was directed at Takaichi. Yet the tweet did not name any individual, and attributing it specifically to her is speculative at best. Within Chinese online discourse, the phrase was more commonly interpreted symbolically, referring to the head of Japanese militarism, rather than to a single politician. Western media, diplomats, and commentators were quick to frame the episode as another example of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, a label routinely used to portray China as uniquely assertive, deliberately provocative, and aggressive. This framing, however, rests on a striking double standard. The United States, often presented as the implicit benchmark of restraint, has a long record of overt military interventions, particularly in the Middle East, that far exceed anything China has undertaken abroad. Against this background, the moral outrage directed at a single provocative tweet appears selective rather than principled. Japan's political leadership nevertheless doubled down on condemning Xue Jian's post. Senior figures, including Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara, former Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi, and Policy Research Council Chair Takayuki Kobayashi, all issued sharp criticisms, reinforcing the narrative of Chinese diplomatic excess. At the same time, Chinese officials responded forcefully to what they described as Takaichi's erroneous and dangerous remarks. Statements of protest were issued by Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning, Taiwan Affairs Office spokesperson Chen Binhua, and Ministry of Defense spokesperson Jiang Bin. The dispute escalated further when both governments lodged formal diplomatic protests against each other's ambassadors on November 13th and 14th, underscoring how Japan's initial rhetoric helped turn a war of words into a full-blown diplomatic confrontation.